Like that happens. And so Egypt literally like sanctions like a way to arrest and to capture Moses for killing an Egyptian. And so what does Moses do? He flees. Like he runs. You're talking the man who was born a slave, raised as royalty, kills a man, totally like denied by Israelites and Egyptians, and he flees and he just hides. And he becomes a shepherd. Okay, and then we have that story about the burning bush where he's just a shepherd minding his own business, and out of nowhere, this bush is burning, but it's not burning, and God begins to speak to him. And he says, Moses, I want you to go, and I want you to lead my people out of slavery. Okay? So let's just like look at this. In the context of Exodus, this is the wildest thing that has ever happened for God's people at this point. God's people are in slavery, and God says to Moses, I want to use you to lead my people out of slavery. Okay, that's a wild concept to me. Like, I want to use you to lead my people out of slavery. And so he goes through, and then at that burning bush, like he shows them the miracles that he's going to use. He shows them like how he's going to support him, how God's going to be behind Moses in this time, how Moses isn't going to go in alone, but God's going to go in with him. Okay, and so Moses goes, he connects with his brother Aaron. They begin this journey of the Exodus of God's people from slavery in Egypt. Okay, so he goes in and he goes up to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh's heart is hard. His heart is so hard, and he says, no, like I will not free your people. And so Moses warns him of each plague that's coming upon Egypt. And those plagues begin, and those plagues, the first plague being that of the Nile River turning to blood. I'm telling you, like that concept, that visual image, man, I'm telling you, right now, erase every silly Sunday school story you've ever heard of the Exodus. Because I feel like sometimes when we think of it, we have like these little cartoon pictures. So we're like, oh yeah, then the river turned red. No, it's freaking blood. Like, that's weird. Totally weird. And then the next one, there's frogs. And my first like inclination, like when I watched like whatever that Moses story movie.
Prince of Egypt?
Yeah, Prince of Egypt. Like when the frogs came and I was a little kid, I was like, that's not even a bad thing. That's pretty cool. Like there's frogs everywhere. But as I was reading, as I was studying for this, I was like, man, like what's going on with the frogs? No. Like frogs were coming out of everything. It said frogs were on stoves, frogs were on slaves, frogs were on people, frogs were coming up out of everywhere. Like, it's like a massive infestation of like frogs, like just everywhere. And so still doesn't let the people go. Then there's an infestation of gnats, which are tremendously more annoying than frogs. And then there's an infestation of flies, which is number 4. Then livestock start dying. So like their way of life, their food, their supply, they start dying. Still nothing. Then they start to develop boils on both man and beast. Okay. So when I was young, I tried to hide from my mom, but I got this horrible like 3rd-degree sunburn. Had boils all over myself. And man, she was not happy when she found out like 3 days later I had these boils and these infections. Not a good thing. But man, they suck. Like they're horrible. And you're talking like all over their body. And then still nothing. Okay, then there was this hail started coming. So this summer we were in India, which is a tremendously hot place. It's hot all the time. Egypt is closer to the equator. It's hot all the time. Can you imagine being in 90-degree weather and frozen rain coming down for the first time? That's a weird thing. Still, Pharaoh does nothing. Then the locusts come, still nothing. And then we're on number 10. And in number 10, Moses approaches Pharaoh and he says to Pharaoh, like, please let my people go. Like, what's going to happen next is horrible, absolutely horrible. What's going to happen next is God's going to come through and he's going to kill the firstborn of every household. So Pharaoh does nothing, absolutely nothing. So Moses leaves and God meets him and he says to Moses, he says, go and tell all of my people to go and to sacrifice their best lamb. He says, take that lamb and the blood of that lamb and wipe it above their door. And the night that I come through and I kill the firstborn of every household, I will pass over my people. In fact, he says, my people will be so safe and so protected that like not even a dog's going to growl at them. And so we have this is playing out, and this night is playing out, and it happens. And the firstborn die in each household, except for God's people. Except for God's people. And God protects them. He spares them. And then immediately preceding, Moses goes to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh says, get them out of here. Like, take the people. And so they leave. They leave slavery. They leave slavery. And this leads us to Exodus 12. This is what I want to examine. This is in remembrance of the Passover when God came and he killed the firstborn of every household except for his people. So we're picking up in Exodus 12, verse 11. Remember, we are almost 1,500 years before the Lord's Supper. So in verse 11, in this manner you shall eat it, with your belt fastened, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. You shall eat it in haste. And so he's talking about the lamb that they sacrificed and wiped above the door. Okay, let's continue. For I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast. And on all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord. The blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are. And when I see that blood, I will pass over you, and no plague will befall you or destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. And he says, this day shall be a day of memorial day, and you shall keep it as a feast to the Lord throughout your generations, as a statute forever. You shall keep it as a feast. Okay, so God is implementing for them the Passover feast. So he says, every day, once a year, on this day, I want you to have a feast to remember that I passed over you, but I also freed you, that I was protecting you, that I was looking out for you every year on this day. And he begins to explain what that feast will look like. He says, 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall remove the leaven out of the houses. For if anyone eats what is leavened from the first day until the 7th day, that person shall be cut off from Israel. Listen, he's implementing this feast that is a big deal. In fact, he says if you go out of the bounds of this feast, you're no longer an Israelite. So they're implementing 1,500 years before the Lord's Supper. They're implementing the Passover feast. Okay, so let's continue. On the first day you shall hold a holy assembly, and on the 7th day a holy assembly. No work shall be done on those days, but what everyone needs to eat, that alone may be prepared for you. And you shall observe the feast of the unleavened bread, for on the very day I brought your hosts out of the land of Egypt. Therefore you shall observe this day throughout your generations as a statute forever. Listen, the Jewish people took that seriously. Man, I was trying to put context in my head of 1,500 years of seriously, and like 1,500 years leading up to the moment where Jesus had the first Lord's Supper. And like, I was even trying to think like how far off George Washington feels like he was. Like literally like 250 years. And that's like less than 6 times. Literally like 250 times 6 is how long we're talking here. 1,500 years on that day, once a year, the Jewish people celebrated. They had a feast of how God freed them, brought ultimate freedom from slavery for his people. He led them out of slavery. And once a year, they celebrated that with the Passover feast. Okay, this is where it gets exciting. The majority of my life, I feel like I misunderstood communion because I always sort of wagered the Old Testament versus the New Testament. It was sort of the Old Covenant versus the New Covenant in my life. But what I'm telling you, what's exciting, is that it's not this versus this. Jesus fulfilled this. He fulfilled the Old Testament. He brought it into completion. And so we're going to jump in. We're going to talk about the Lord's Supper, the first one, 1,500 years after Passover was implemented, after Jewish people met yearly on this moment to celebrate Passover for 1,500-year-old tradition. They took the unleavened bread and they feasted. They took the wine and they feasted and they celebrated